Hello and welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and working in distributed organizations. This podcast is brought to you by Virtual Not Distant, where we help managers and teams transition to an office-optional approach. Find out everything we do over at virtualnotdistant.com and check out our show notes and pictures of our lovely guests over on the podcast page. It's great to have you here, listeners. Let's get on with the show. Hello and welcome to episode 283, which is a very special episode because it's an edited version of a live event, of a live talk, chat that Dr. Richard MacKinnon and I did back in July 2021. And this is a talk on loneliness and disconnections in remote teams that we did as part of the Learning Lounge of the EI Evolution, where EI stands for Emotional Intelligence. So let me tell you just a little bit about that event, the EI Evolution, in case emotional intelligence is something that you are very interested in. This is an online event that is taking place on the 12th of October 2021, which also happens to be my Saint's Day because my name is Pilar Ortiz. Lovely to meet you if we haven't met before. And Daniel Goleman is going to be there as part of the event. So if you're a fan and you want to see him live, this is your chance. Now, as well as the day, there is also, as part of that event, the Learning Lounge. And the Learning Lounge is an area where you can find recordings to different talks that took place between May and August, I think, 2021. And they are all either around customer experience, employee experience, or the world of remote work. Hence why I thought that this might interest you. And also, this is why we took part. So you will recognize a couple of other names there if you've been listening to the show for a while. And you can book a ticket for both the 12th of October and to have access to the Learning Lounge over at eievolution.com/events. And you can get a 10% discount if you use the code PilarOrti10, 10% and my name. So PilarOrti10. So that's a call to action for those of you who might be interested in that. Now, if we haven't met before, my name is Pilar Ortiz. I'm the director of Virtual Not Distant, which is the company behind this show. Many people call this the Virtual Not Distant podcast, which I suppose is sticking more than 21st Century Work Life, which is the official name. So what we do, we help managers of remote teams, and also we've now got a program which you might be interested in because it's all around the topic of connection in remote teams. But I will tell you about that after the conversation with Richard. So today, Sandra Thompson is the lady who's organizing the EI Evolution event, and she is the first Goleman emotional intelligence coach in the UK. And she was actually on the show together with Rowena Hennigan talking about emotional intelligence in remote teams. So if you're interested in that, look for episode 248. And as I said, this conversation is between myself, and Sandra is also present, but between myself and Dr. Richard MacKinnon. He really gives gravitas to the conversation because he's an organizational psychologist and a coach. And I regularly join him as co-host in My Pocket Psych, which is all about the psychology of the workplace. So you might want to check that one out. The only call to action that I want to give you before we move on to the conversation is if you have any stories of experiencing loneliness in remote teams, especially pre-pandemic, but also during the pandemic, and especially what has helped you feel connected to your team members, feel connected to your job when you're away from the people you work with. Basically, if you have any examples that can help us, that's Pilar and Richard, and other listeners that can help us to understand what people go through when they feel disconnected from their colleagues, and even when isolation starts to creep in because we might not be seeing our colleagues regularly, then please get in touch. So you can email me, pilar@virtualnotdistant.com, or we also have a contact form over at virtualnotdistant.com. So I will be back after the conversation to talk about a program we have around this and podcasting for connection. But for now, let's go beyond the water cooler. One of the reasons why I thought it'd be interesting to have this conversation, and in particular with Richard, because he's a psychologist, which I'm not, is that the title of the session was also Beyond #water cooler, because what I've seen is that over the last, especially 18 months, the main way of addressing the fact that we're away from each other, the fact that we're missing some social contact, some deeper connection, has been with the creation of the water cooler channels or the virtual coffees. And these are really important practices that we've had in distributed companies for many years, pre-pandemic, which are all about creating the space for social connection that we might otherwise miss if we're away from each other. And of course, now that companies are starting to decide whether remote work is for them, whether they want to continue investing in some of their people working away from each other, this whole aspect of the fact that loneliness is very real in the workplace, and it's even more visible when we are away from each other. This is becoming quite an important conversation. This conversation was in the space already. We have, as part of 21st Century Work Life podcast, a whole 7-episode series, which started in the beginning of 2020, which is all about connection and disconnection in remote teams. Richard was part of that. So this is a conversation that's already been in the space. But now it's growing. And so I thought it'd be nice to talk to Richard and also to distinguish between the loneliness that people might have felt during the pandemic and remote work during the pandemic, and the one that could be there even if everything is open, just because of that distance and how we feel that distance. So is there anything else I need to say before we start to look at some definitions, Richard?
I think that distinction is the really useful one, pandemic versus post-pandemic, the distinction between enforced working remotely versus I want to do it, or that's how our organization does it. Different factors at play there. So we don't want to draw too much from the pandemic experience and view that as how things should be done.
Yeah. So there will be those elements of still in pandemic, we'll probably do things that then we adjust. And the other thing is, of course, if we're looking at especially loneliness and isolation, some people might not experience loneliness even if they're disconnected from their team members, because they find that social connection somewhere else in the community, in other activities, which of course wasn't possible during the pandemic. So I think it's important to see how that has affected us. So, and in fact, Richard, it's quite important, I suppose, that we talk about disconnection sometimes, but we also talk about loneliness. So I suppose it's important to distinguish them, isn't it?
I think it is, and they're not interchangeable. I mean, within the organization, you could feel a slight disconnection from your colleagues because you're working remotely, but in no way could you feel lonely. It might be about keeping up to date with what's going on, but you feel a sufficient depth to your relationships. On the other hand, you could be very lonely in the same situation because you don't feel you have that number and depth of relationships that you're looking for. And of course, what we don't want to do is assume that each of us is the bar, each of us is the comparator. There's an enormous diversity in based on personality and other factors about what people are looking for from their relationships. So I've said it countless times before, but we should try and avoid one-size-fits-all solutions when we're thinking about something that is so diverse in its manifestation. So let's try and keep those two things separate if we can.
Great. So let's start then with looking at loneliness. And we've got a definition or a couple of definitions, which always get the brain going. So we have a definition from Sarah Wright. And this is something that one of your guests, Richard, mentioned, Antonia Dietman, in episode 84 of My Pocket Psych, which is all about loneliness in the workplace, not specifically about remote work, which is interesting because it exists also in colocated. So episode 84 of My Pocket Psych, Antonia quotes Sarah Wright as saying that the definition of workplace loneliness is the distress caused by the perceived lack of good quality interpersonal relationships in a work environment. And already this, Richards, gives us so much to work with. You're looking at quality versus quantity, aren't we?
And it's a perception. So it's a subjective experience. So I can't say to you, Pilar, you shouldn't be lonely. You've got 5 close colleagues at work. So, that's the cutoff point. No loneliness for you. And of course, it shows us that we could also be surrounded by people in a co-located space or have lots of contact with people when working remotely and still experience loneliness because we don't experience the depth that we're looking for. Now, having the awareness of what you're looking for is really important, and we'll turn to that in a moment. But where there is that discrepancy between what we're looking for and what we're experiencing, that loneliness will manifest. And as Antonia mentioned in our interview, it has real consequences, not just for our performance at work, but for our well-being. It's a toxic experience. It's extremely bad for us, and it has the kind of marked impact on our well-being comparable with really unhealthy behaviors, let's say. And so it's something that we need to look out for, because it is not, as the perception might be, some failing on the individual's point or some sign of weakness or something. It's a really distressing experience. So it should get our attention when we're designing work environments and how we communicate.
And that is what it, without going into this right now, because we've got this later on in the conversation, the fact that you mentioned that it could be seen as a sign of weakness. There's all this stuff that stops us from talking about it and from addressing it. So we'll come into that a bit later on, but I just thought it was worth just grabbing that for now. And we also have another definition, which is my favorite one. And this comes from the Disconnection series. And it was by Dr. Julianne Hoff-Lundstad. And it's very similar, but it's about the gap between the actual level of social interaction and connectedness versus that which is desired or preferred. And I love this because I am thinking that sometimes even having to have lots of touch points, so lots of meetings, lots of virtual coffees, lots of things that we have to do together, leaving our Slacks open all day so that we can all be available. For some people, that could cause that sense of isolation.
Absolutely. That what might be well-intentioned could actually have negative unintended consequences. So the go-to responses to the fear of disconnection might actually cause more problems than they solve. So first of all, I think organizations need to have a think about, how do we know this is going to work? Or how do we know people are asking for this, rather than, hey, let's have a few more meetings. Let's have a few more get-togethers.
Yeah. Or let's bring everyone back into the office. Then they'll feel less lonely. And then we haven't got that in our notes, but maybe if we have time, we should go back into that, because that is also something I'm hearing is, everyone needs to come back to the office because of the social element and to prevent loneliness. Well, actually, really? Where's the evidence? I would say
it's the same argument around productivity. There's no evidence around that productivity argument, but there is an argument for empty offices not being profitable. But that's not the same thing.
Yeah. We will put a note if we have time at the end of this. We can talk about that. I'm just going to say, Sandra, you are back there, just in case there's any comments or anything around any of this at the moment. If there isn't, then let us know as well.
And as if by magic, here's a question. If loneliness is a person's perception of a gap, then can organizations or managers help with this gap?
Yes, although it's important when we look at that, and it's a great question. I love that you're looking at the gap and not preventing loneliness or solving loneliness. The first thing that comes to mind is that as long as we're coming from the self-awareness point of view, and as long as what we are doing is helping people understand what that gap is and helping us as managers and other team members to understand what the gap is, then I can see there's definitely a role. And even sometimes if you look at the role of the manager, who very often is the person that has an overview and whose job it is to understand what people need and find a common way of addressing as much as we can, even the individual needs, then yes, because we might be seeing that. We might be seeing that one of our team members is over-connected, and that is doing their head in. Maybe they're not feeling lonely, but maybe it's having some other impact. And someone else we know is really missing the in-person connection. So we're going to need to have some kind of conversation in the team or some way of addressing it that is more than, oh, let's just do X. So definitely, I think as a person connecting their team members or at an organizational level, looking after the well-being of everyone, I think definitely. Richard, what do you think?
I was just going to say, whoever's responsible for the well-being agenda, and hopefully there is one in each organization, that loneliness needs to be on that agenda. It is a subjective experience, but so is stress. And we measure that, and we know what leads to stress or strain, and we know how to deal with that. And I think because of the stigma associated with loneliness to a large extent, it doesn't get the same experience, but it can have similarly toxic impacts on people. One really important thing I think we need to consider is the context in which it happens. And by context, I mean things like organizational culture, job design, contact with others, but also things like manager or team leader behaviors, where they're coming from in terms of proactivity around contact, and naturally occurring touch points versus organized things. But these are topics that you would want to ensure managers are addressing in the regular conversations they have with their team members, just like workload, just like career well-being, to include how are you feeling about your relationships and connectedness, to open up that conversation.
And as you were saying that, I was thinking that one thing that organizations can do is measure loneliness in some way, the same way as you're saying you measure stress. So integrate that into their well-being strategy specifically, just so that we know what's going on, so that we can design for it. So really by keeping an eye out, measuring when possible, etc. Yeah, great question. Have we got any more, Sandra?
You have two more, and I just wanted to say something actually in response to what you've just said. The point around measuring the quality of relationships is such an intelligent way to ask, because ultimately asking a question directly, a kind of emotional question through a kind of method that means you get a kind of binary answer, it seems a really smart way to go. So I've definitely learned something as well just then. Two questions, and I'm not sure if both of them are relevant for now, but I'm going to give you both questions if that's all right. The first one is there a link between extroverts and introverts and the different ways they deal with loneliness?
Shall we move that to the self-awareness bit, Richard? Yeah, so
I think
extrovert
we'll
versus
address
introvert.
that next, yeah.
And the next one, Sandra?
So does this boil down to introversion versus extroversion? Open plan offices are often indifferent to these differences. Does online make this easier or just more complicated for the management of the team?
Great.
Would you like me to read that again, or good?
No. That's great.
I'm going back to. I'm going back for a cup of tea. I'll let you guys crack on.
So great question, taking us somewhere new. So I think we'll go into the self-awareness aspect of it, because this is about that. It's also about whether extroverts or introverts are more at risk of feeling lonely, I think, at work. And then all the stuff that you've mentioned in the question, open plan offices, we can come to all of that. So if the definition of loneliness is something around the difference between the degree of interaction that you want and that you have, what is that degree of connection? And maybe it's something that as professionals, as knowledge workers, it's another thing we have to be aware of, as well as what's the environment that helps me to be more productive. Now it's going to be, okay, what level of connection with my colleagues, with my team members, with the workplace, outside of work? what levels of connection do I need to make sure I stay healthy? So I'll start with one example, and it'd be great to see in the chat as well any examples that you have watching right now. Is that so? The reason we did the Connection Disconnection series in the podcast was because Tim Burgess, who was one of the collaborators on that, for him it was something that's been really on his mind as the manager of a distributed team. For me, as someone who's worked freelance a lot, who works in remote teams often, this has never been an issue. And so I started to think, what is it that I'm doing that means that I'm not putting myself at risk of feeling lonely, even if sometimes I don't really have any decent conversations all day, or all my conversations are at a distance. And one thing I've realized is I use my local gym very frequently. And I go to classes there, and I very regularly see the same people. And I've started to wonder whether just those small touch points mean that I don't feel lonely as a person, and therefore I don't need that much interaction with my workmates. And I came across this terminology, which is the weak tie events. Tie as in the ties we have with other people. And apparently they make us feel good. So maybe that's enough for me. Richard.
I think that's a great point, and it's good to make it human. What is the human experience to move this into the practical things? I mean, one of the things that, as we say, you can't solve someone else's loneliness. Let's put it that way. You can't do something to them. But as part of these conversations, it's really useful, I would suggest, for individuals to reflect on their needs, as we've just heard, and also their emotional experiences. We need to develop, I would say, as a species, our emotional literacy to understand better what it is that we're experiencing at any moment in time. And this has a number of benefits, but very, very simply, emotional literacy is being able to notice your emotions, name them, understand how they impact you, where they're coming from. And the reason that's important is that we can experience an emotion at a point in time that's related to a memory from the past or an anticipated event in the future. And just being able to notice my anxiety is not because I'm speaking to Pilar now, it's because I'm thinking about a meeting tomorrow. That can help me better understand how is work having an impact on my emotional life. Similarly, being able to distinguish the emotions from each other to get a little bit more detailed around that. The example I use when talking about this to audiences is many people find it difficult to distinguish between hunger and thirst. They go to get food when actually what they really need is water. And actually, if you think about discomfort inside of you, sometimes it's very difficult to describe to someone else where that's coming from. It's kind of in there because I don't know what's in there. It's often the same with our emotional life. I feel things I like, I feel things I don't like, and then I act on them because I think that's the natural thing to do. And because loneliness is it has that sort of negative connotation. It has that stigma associated with it. We might misinterpret it when it shows up. We might think, well, I spoke to loads of people today. I can't be lonely, but I'm feeling very, and I don't know what to call that. So for many of us, it might be a case of, first of all, saying to ourselves, maybe I am lonely. Maybe that's the emotion I'm experiencing. Maybe that's the term to use. And naming these things can be really useful because then we know what we could start to do to make a change. So I would argue it starts with self-awareness, getting specific and interested in our emotional experiences and noticing how different situations, different people, different activities will contribute to that rich emotional life that we all have, but sometimes we're not that connected with. Does that make sense, Pilar?
Yeah, and what it's made me think, and this is just my own opinion, is that especially thinking about the most recent times, the pandemic, etc., whether sometimes what we were feeling maybe was not loneliness, but something else, and the other way around. Sometimes I might experience anger, and actually that anger might come from not having had these good quality interactions that I wanted, going back to the gap. So I think that's really interesting, that self-awareness of what is it, where it's coming from. And that might be very new for some people to have to experience that, because maybe we haven't been in that situation.
But also to be aware of how it impacts our behavior. And that's another point, because sometimes emotions will show up and have an impact on behavior that others don't recognize as that emotion. So, for example, sometimes when we're anxious, our behavior can look quite aggressive or impatient, not worried. And so if someone's feeling loneliness, their behavior may not look like someone who stereotypically is quiet and withdrawn, but maybe more not wanting to connect because they're worried that if they try, they'll get rejected, and that would be even more painful. So we need to think broadly and flexibly about how this loneliness might manifest, and not all for the same reason for everyone, and not all in the same way.
And again, going back to this, how much do I need to feel connected to an individual during my day, whether it's in the workplace or outside, and being aware of that. So I wonder whether here we could bring the question about, so extroverts versus introverts. Is this something, I mean, I haven't looked at any literature that's got to do with loneliness around extroversion or introversion. Have you, Richard?
No, because I think, and this is not a commentary on the question. It's a really common way about how we talk about personality, but it's quite binary, and actually it'd be useful to look at it in a bit more detail with maybe the 5-factor model of personality, the big 5 or so on. But I think there's a really important point to be made here, that we might carry around stereotypes about extroverts and introverts. That's very common in the workplace. But let's remember, even if putting those aside, the loneliness is subjective. That means that someone who is has an introverted preference could still feel lonely, even though they're not getting all of the contact and interaction that we might think an extrovert might look for. An introvert could still feel lonely because the depth isn't there. And an extrovert in the same position, and I'm being very, very basic in those descriptions, but an extrovert in exactly the same position could also feel lonely because they're getting lots of ad hoc connection and chat, but they're still missing the depth of relationships. And maybe the difference between them is maybe a bit of a red herring, and it's more about the system that they find themselves in. Personality will definitely play a role, but I think a really useful starting point is the one that Pilar mentioned, which is about people considering their individual needs. What do I need, and how do I meet those needs, and how much of it is up to me to initiate, and how much of it is maybe a limitation of the way my job is organized. But asking about personality is a great question because it definitely plays a role. But what I always try and do is avoid stereotypes or scapegoating. Well, of course, they're that because they're that when it comes to personality. But maybe the second question about it, does the online/remote make this more complex? I wonder, because I wonder how visible loneliness would be in a co-located workspace where we could see people all the time. Maybe they're having lots of conversation, but they don't have that depth and maybe that trust with others, but they could look very interactive and very chatty. It doesn't mean that it's any easier. I think what we need to do is maybe be more proactive about the communication about it when we're not co-located, because we could easily fall into the trap of assuming everyone's okay, or because I'm okay, everyone else is okay. What do you think, Pilar?
Yeah, I think the same thing, that, well, we've got a lot of stuff there. The I'm okay, therefore everyone else is okay is huge. And just going back also to what you were saying about how sometimes someone feeling lonely might behave in ways that we don't associate with loneliness. I think that is really important when we're going right back to the question around managers and organizations. That's another way that we can assume what's going on without sitting down and asking or whatever. And then around the co-located space versus the online space, I think it does add levels of complexity. Definitely now, when people might continue to have to do work online and remote work, even though they don't want to, the same as they might, we've got a very icky situation at the moment. Even when we have the ideal remote work scenario, so the distributed companies with no pandemic, so people can move around if they need to, blah, blah, blah. I think that we still need to be very deliberate in the online space. So it's the same as all communication and all practices online in the remote work, in the remote world. We need to know that if we don't ask, we probably won't hear. Knowing that if we don't have a set of processes or rituals in place to help some of our team members with this loneliness, they're not going to happen. But what the online world does do is it makes it easier to hide. And I can see how that cycle of, it can really become a spiral that goes out of control if you are the person who starts to feel lonely or doesn't understand why, and you just start to retreat. When you're away from each other, it's easier. Whereas if you have to be in the same physical space, I think you're probably someone is more likely to catch on to something, but it depends, because you might be great at faking that everything is okay when you're still, and that's another way of growing that. So I'm not sure. This is great questions.
I'd come full circle back to, let's ensure we can equip managers to have these conversations in a well-being sense, to ensure whether people are co-located or distributed, they're getting an opportunity to talk about that well-being aspect of connection, relationships, involvement, loneliness, and whether what the organization or what the individual manager is doing to try and increase it is working for them. Does it meet their needs? Because there's going to be a diversity of that as well. We all saw the really well-meaning initiatives at the beginning of lockdown, where there were pizza nights remotely and drinks nights remotely and pub quizzes remotely. That is not going to necessarily address anyone's loneliness. In fact, it could just increase the amount of hours they spend looking at their colleagues. And for some people, that's great. A bit of light touch chats, social, but for others, it's going to be an additional burden. So I think there's an important point about asking about people's needs and how they can be met, but also equipping individuals with the self-awareness to spot that they need something else. Because we can't lay this all on the organization or the manager or the individual. It's contextual. It's a factor of all of those.
Yeah. And then just going back to the specific question around open plan offices, I think it's the same thing. It really so depends, because someone, just going back to these weak time moments, if you already have one or two good friendships that give you that good quality relationships, or if you have 2 or 3 teammates with whom you really get into meaty conversations and you really feel connected, understood, then an open plan office might just give you some light touch points, with other people, and that might be great. Or it could be that you realize, that thing of, you realize, I'm here with all these people, I see them every day, I don't have anything to talk to them about. So again, it is so complex, and the context, everything, it's wonderful, wonderfully complex.
Let's make that distinction again. Sorry to cut across you, Pilar, but that distinction between enforced homeworking during a pandemic means that it was done largely rushed, without much planning, and with little to no training for people to work in a different way. And so responses to that were almost certainly similarly kind of rushed, well-intentioned, but maybe not something that's going to work over the longer term. But remembering that what we need is going to differ depending on whether we want to work remotely or whether that's been done to us. And a conversation that I've had so many times with coachees over the last 18 months has been about addressing, and I think this is very pertinent to this office-based versus remote, this conversation about the blanks in our minds getting filled in with worries about what other people are thinking about us or other people's level of busyness. And what this does is it prevents people from reaching out, making contact, asking questions. And so they'll look at themselves and say, well, I'm really busy. He is as well. I don't want to bother him. Is the co-located space, it might be much easier for them to just turn to the person and ask them a question. So part of this is, are people equipped to maintain those ties and meet their needs when they are distributed or whether they're co-located, and to ensure that people have the skills and the awareness and the team ties that will allow them to reach out, connect, have conversations. This is separate to loneliness. This is just basic getting the job done stuff.
Yes. Yeah. Great. So Sandra, I think we can see if any of the audience is still with us and if there's any thoughts, or indeed you, Sandra, anything you want to add?
So there's no more questions yet, but I have a feeling that they might be brewing. I have a couple of things really drawing on quite a lot of what Richard has said, actually. So Lisa Feldman-Barrett, who's a neuroscientist, is speaking on the 12th of October. And many of the things that you've touched on, Richard, on the point of emotion, recognizing it, understanding it, having the opportunity to have a discussion about it. And Pilar, what's your experience of people using tools in the distributed space to bring about that lexicon, that range of words to help people describe how they're feeling? Is this a thing for remote companies to proactively give people tools to find the right word to say what they're feeling?
When you say tools, do you mean think frameworks and stuff like that?
The thing that's coming to mind is a deck of cards that have words on it that describe emotion. So we're like playing a deck of cards, and I'll pick out a series of words that are spot on as far as how I'm feeling. And then we could have a discussion about them rather than just having a chat about emotion without something that helps make that kind of break the ice a little bit, using something that can help bring that conversation about.
Yeah, so nothing comes to mind that specific. I also wonder whether this is still something that we're catching up with as well. And I also wonder whether this is a conversation that's really grown because of the forced remote work as well. Because I think that before what we found was that people who gravitated towards remote work, they already... it was a choice, but also they had a support system already in place outside of work, or they were okay looking for that. It doesn't mean that, of course, these conversations haven't happened before. The other thing is, of course, that all of this takes so much time. So it will depend on the culture, of course. It will depend on, I think, at a team level, on the manager. So I think it's always about what is pressing in the team and I think the culture, but no, I don't have any examples. Richard, do you have any examples?
Well, over the last few years, I've been using something that maybe attendees are familiar with, acceptance and commitment theory, or ACT. And that a large component of that is about values, what we think is important, but also our inner life, our thoughts and our emotions, and equipping people with the tools to have a better relationship with their thoughts and emotions. And all I mean by that is so that they're not led by those things, but they make conscious decisions as to how they want to show up in a given moment. That is a tool. They're skills, and you can learn those, and you can learn to spot the emotions, see them for what they are, spot the thoughts, almost sidestep them so that they don't take over. They're not in the driving seat. And it's a very useful framework of skills because it could help navigate, for example, the discomfort of talking to your manager about your loneliness. You could use those principles to say, oh, this is a grim conversation, but it's important to me to have it because of bum, 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 bum.
I remember seeing a little clip, actually. It was a cartoon of a bus, and it was about the emotions of people getting on the bus that were representing emotions, and the fact that you could turn the volume down. You couldn't necessarily try and ignore them or put them to one side because they would become more amplified. But I think your point around ACT is brilliantly placed. The final thing I'll say, and then I'm going to go back again, is that there are a number of tools that I've used in my coaching experience, and there's something called the Emotional Culture Deck, which is created by a Kiwi, actually, a New Zealand gentleman who was in a position where he felt that people would speak about emotion, that the whole myth of we don't like talking about it isn't necessarily true. But if you gave someone something that could help enable them to talk about it, so he created one. So that's the Emotional Culture Deck from, I think, called Elephants and Riders. But I'm going to keep an eye on the chat now. I'm going to leave you two to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandra. And you take us beautifully to the next point, which is all around communication as well. So this is something that maybe we want to start looking at is when we have our reviews in our team or our meetings, what is it that we could do to start to open up these kind of conversations? And if we are a team where we know that we are lacking the vocabulary because it's not in our culture to bring some of these things up, then maybe we should start to look at something external that is going to help us. Some of what Sandra's mentioning, for example. At the same time, sometimes it's just enough to open the space for this conversation. So going back to the role of managers and indeed team members who care and who care about the team, and also who want to have a space for themselves to be able to bring these things up. I was just listening to, again, another conversation from the Disconnection series, and someone was mentioning how in Shield Geo, Tim, who's one of the founders, every now and then in their water cooler channels or interesting stuff channels, don't know what it was, will share some articles that talk about some of this stuff. So they will say, have a look at this. It talks about, I don't know, the dangers of disconnection, or the fact that it can creep very easily in, or it could be a podcast. It could be something that we share as a starting point, and starting to bring these things up, not as big conversations, but just as things that we can touch on. Then someone can go, actually, you know what? I never thought of that. That's what I've been feeling. So sometimes it's just even opening up the conversation to give someone a way in.
And anything that signposts it's okay to talk about this stuff is great. Maybe I could mention Antonia Dietman again, Dr. Antonia Dietman, because her PhD was all about the role of chats, social chats in the workplace. Now, her research was carried out in co-located spaces, but what she demonstrated was the power of the brief social chat for building team trust, for example, and actually giving people a simple framework for how to have a chat, almost jumping off points, and how to start a non-work related chat that lasts a minute or so, really had a positive impact. Now, not every team is going to need cards on how to have a chat, but what I find myself reminding clients of a lot is actually encourage chat. It might seem like a distraction from the job, but actually people are learning about each other. People are learning about each other's preferences and their whole life, not just what they can observe at work, whether it's co-located or not. And that is deepening levels of trust. So people will see each other as people and not as jobs. And that can only be for the good. So the little, how was your weekend, or did you watch X on Netflix, does contribute to how we work together.
And if we go back to everything we've been talking about, the spectrum along which we may feel lonely, the gap between how much interaction we want and the kind of interactions, and then going back to Sandra's point around what tools can we give people, a list of conversation starters sometimes could be good because sometimes the less we see our colleagues, the more distant we feel. And then the more difficult it might be just to start a conversation that could be social, or it could be about the work, but not about the work we do together. So that could also be something that, as a preventative measure, that we help our people start conversations that are not in our schedule, that are not task related, work related. That could be that. I think we can't underestimate. This is going back to how deliberate we need to be in the online space.
The way we might worry how others view us if we're socially chatting, because the concern for your productivity when you're in lockdown, for example, has been quite marked among some people, and that presence is a problem. So you worry about, well, but we need to get past that, and we need to not replicate the co-located space, but replicate the human connection that we can have when we're working together. And starting it, I think, Pilar, you're definitely onto something there. Starting it removes the inertia, and then we can let people get on with it. But there are so many things that can get in the way. Will they be interested? Will this be a strange question? What will they think of me? Are they busy? Do we have time? All that stuff. So instead, role modeling this, team leaders and managers, by initiating these conversations and asking people non-task related things, normalizes it. And that can go a long way to ensuring that other people do it.
And then on the flip side, this is the part that I think is often missed when we're talking about the loneliness and sense of connection, is how much some people, like myself, love talking about the work. and love developing relationships with the professional side of the person. And this is, of course, where the whole concept of visible teamwork comes through. Because if I'm co-located in an office with you, my sense of connection to other people and my sense of being with other people can come from hearing about the work. This is why so many people go to co-working spaces. They don't go to cafes. They don't go to social clubs. They go to places where people are working, where the atmosphere is about the work, where people come and talk about the work. So I think that another piece is understanding how much some of us need to feel connected through the work. And what can we do? Because then we can start different ways of designing. Because instead of having virtual coffees, we might decide that we change how we work on a task. So, Richard, maybe I've been working on putting this podcast together and working on the script, and it's taken me ages, and I didn't talk to you through it because I just wanted to get on with it. But if we'd worked together on it, then maybe that would have been another way. And that can be a way of having very meaningful conversations, because then you get to really get to the work. So I think that's often a missed point.
I was going to say codependency, interdependency that we can create where, I need you need me, and we're going to have to work together if we're going to get a good result, or better than if we were working in isolation. So another example of how we can create these opportunities. I suppose the other thing to throw in here around this is boundaries. That understanding people's needs for boundaries. A lot of people have suffered over the last 18 months because their boundaries have been eroded by this enforced working at home, and they've had to work very hard to recreate them or create new boundaries. But if we look to the future, and if we look to increased distributed work and distributed teams, understanding people's needs for social contact and their needs for certain boundaries, it's going to be really important, because my need to chat and send you messages, Pilar, might conflict with your need for a break or some focused work, or indeed, hey, it's after hours. I don't want to be talking about work right now. You might want to talk, but I don't want to talk about work. So there's a whole bunch of skills wrapped up in this. And I think the last 18 months have shown that these things don't happen automatically. Some people get it, some people don't, and we're struggling through it. So I think the intentionality, the proactivity around this really needs to be upped once we are out of this really terrible pandemic situation.
Yeah, and feeling misunderstood, like you're saying, feeling like you're getting lots of messages or whatever, and that can be, and your boundaries are not being respected. That can lead to feelings of loneliness, that feeling disconnected in a very emotional level. And the other thing I just wanted to bring up, it's a little bit to the side, is when you and I were working earlier on the document, on the Google document just now. You're in London, I'm in Spain, and for me, just seeing you pop up in the document and replying to my chat, that might be all the interaction I need. But that is really important. So I think, again, and this is something that organizations have missed out on, is what are the tools we have that we have to use for our work, that either tweaking their settings or pointing the direction to people about certain aspects of the tool, about certain features, can help with this as well. What have we already got that we're not making the most out of? And this is something that I know a lot of people haven't realized, that when someone is connected to the tool at the same time, that you can see it and that you can maybe reach out to them. So I think that is also something that is there to exploit.
Definitely. And with those tools, there's often no need for more tools. In fact, that's probably the last thing we need in most workplaces right now. Yes. But it's also more doesn't equal better. So more use of these, it's smart use of these. And we've talked about this quite a lot, Pilar, in our podcasting relationship. Just because a tool is deployed in an organization, it in no way means that everyone knows how to use it. Because often there's no training to accompany it. It's rolled out, but then people have to figure out how to use these things. So my other plea for organizations would be, if you're looking at connectedness, if you're looking at dealing with a distributed workforce, you need to ensure that people are trained appropriately to use these amazing tools and to get the most out of them, so they understand what's happening when they're interacting with others.
And that is what dehumanizes the experience. It's not the technology. It's not being able to use the technology. It can feel very lonely when you're really struggling with something and everyone else isn't. So that's really important. Before I call on Sandra again to pop over, I just want to mention just co-working spaces, because this is really, I've just been working on an episode for 21st Century Work Life on it, because I think it's the missing piece. It could be that the solution or the prevention of one of our employees' loneliness is not in the workplace. It could be that it is on providing them with another environment that can take care of some of those needs. And then, of course, you don't want them disconnected from the workplace, but connected to another social thing. But I think that there are other ways as well in which we can help people not feel as lonely when they're away from us. So I just wanted to just drop that into the conversation, because I think it's been missed because we've got working from home or in the office, but there are sometimes other, or giving people the option to choose where they work, because then they can work from somewhere where they feel more connected to a community that makes them feel better. Those needs are met there. And then we come to the workplace as a happier, healthier person. Sandra, are you around to pop in? Anything in the chat? Anyone still with us? Any questions that you have?
So I have a few statements that people have made that I'd like to share with you. And then I have a question as well. John has said, your boundaries point is very interesting because we don't know how to stop the home boundaries trespassing on the workspace when we're not used to it. Hard to say no to emails out of hours, for example, or allowing the cat to monopolize the team meeting. As a comment from John. Teresa is saying interdependence is underestimated, I think. It is sometimes through working together that we learn about each other, building trust and reinforcing each other's commitment. Two more. You are a highly engaged audience here. Nigel is saying, I find emotions often reside and show up in the physical body. Helping people to become aware, locating them, accepting them, and letting them pass through can be very healing and relieving. And finally, Kim is asking a question. I've not heard of this. Anyone else use the Jellyman tree to help people identify how they're feeling? And I've asked Kim if she is able to share it, but Richard is nodding. So that's a good sign.
Sorry, no.
Oh, no, I thought you were nodding. Sorry, Richard.
I'm taking notes. I'm trying to learn.
Okay. So hopefully Kim will share that. Now, the question I have is a little bit random. I find that I get deeper connections with people when they open up around their humour. And I find a connection in comedy and wit. Discuss. I don't know where to take that. That's kind of a statement, but I wonder how being brave, maybe being courageous and putting it out there to see whether anyone connects with you. Because I think in an open plan office, I've definitely overheard people making the odd comment. I'm like, yeah, that's definitely my humour. I'm going to go and talk to them. They got Blackadder going on. It's all good. But in the remote space, how might something like that build deeper connections?
So if we view it as maybe one aspect of who we are, it's a preference that we have. It's something that we can connect with others and share that sort of Venn diagram of us. This is the bit we have in common, and maybe we can use it to diffuse difficult situations, or that could be our thing. We're the people that get that, and that's a nice relationship. We know that you can use humor to deal with difficult situations as a coping strategy, and it can contribute to your resilience. However, it's a double-edged sword, because as we know, humor is not universal, and use of humor needs to be carefully thought through. It might be that being distributed means that that's easier than in a co-located space where someone you don't intend to hear it hears it. But whenever it comes up, I always say it is a double-edged sword. It can be a great thing for bonding with others, but it doesn't always translate for people. And of course, what is safe for workplace versus not? That's another question.
Mm-hmm. I think that being distributed, and this is a numbers game maybe, being distributed can give us even more of a chance of finding someone with a common sense of humor and someone with whom we can connect in that way. And I want to refer back to Chris Coladonato, who I talk to a lot about this kind of stuff. And she's been a remote worker for 12 years in an organization which also had people in the office. And she very deliberately builds her internal network. There's a lot of them. There's 1,200 people. They have a Yama, so an internal social network where different people talk about different things. And she looks at stuff, and she will connect with people maybe she hasn't even met in the organization before. So I think that it's another skill. It's another radar. So it's about when we are looking at those work communications, it's about what can we see about the person that is not the work? How are they expressing it? Do they use emojis like I use them? Do they not use emojis like I don't use them? What language do they use? And also, if we are in the synchronous space, then how do they behave in meetings? What language do they use? Is that a person that I could connect with a little bit more? Is that someone I want to get to know better? So I think you've got, like with everything, you've got the individual. So you've got to take responsibility if that's something that's important to you to find it. At the team level, at the manager level, we've got to create enough different shared experiences so that different parts of us come up, including the social, because the social is still, I think, at least how I see it, the part where more people bring more of themselves and where humor really shines more than in the directly work-related conversations, but there's everything. And then at an organizational level, especially when there are a lot of us, what kind of cross-functional things can we give to people so that they can discover people that maybe they don't really connect as much with their team, but they connect with someone else. And because we're distributed, we're all more accessible to each other. So there's loads there, Sandra.
Incredible, really. Where to start? Richard, you have something about to say.
Well, I just wanted to come back to that earlier point mentioned by one of our attendees about boundaries and working from home. Totally empathize with the challenges people have faced working from home and maintaining a routine, maintaining professionalism, focus, whatever it is that's been a challenge. What I would say to everyone, though, is that that's not been us at our best. For example, we're working from home in a pandemic while educating children and minding pets and maybe sharing the working space with 4 adults. So if we look to the future, the working from home experience ideally will not be under those pressures, but it still requires skill to do it effectively. But my hope would be that people's working from home experience isn't evaluated purely on the last year. It can be a seamless, wonderful experience, and it's not all about survival.
Any last comments? That was a whammy.
Yeah, thank you for having us, because this is a very broad conversation. And all I hope is that people really take the time to think about it rather than coming to quick assumptions and solutions about it. So thank you, Sandra, for giving us the platform.
It's been an absolute pleasure, because my ears have been ringing with emotional intelligence and self-awareness and emotional literacy. So thank you both.
Well, thank you, Sandra Thompson, so much for inviting us to be part of the EI Evolution event. And listeners, if you want to attend the event, remember it's on the 12th of October. You can book over at eievolution.com/events. And if you use the discount code PILARORT10, you can get 10% off the price. So I hope you enjoyed that. And thanks, Richard, for also giving permission to repurpose this conversation. And thanks, Sandra, for suggesting that we can also share this with our feed. And listeners, thank you very much for listening. Now, if this is a topic that you want to contribute to, this is going to be such an important topic. I mean, it already is, but as more and more organizations adopt proper remote work, not just working from home during the pandemic, this is something we need to be looking at. So please send any stories or thoughts through. I'd be delighted to hear from you, pilar@virtualnotdistant.com. Now, Richard and I are preparing at the moment a workshop around this theme for managers in organizations, looking at recognizing loneliness, understanding what to do about it, etc., even trying to prevent it. So we're working on that at the moment. So if that's of interest do you get in touch. And also, we now have at Virtual Not Distant a program called Podcasting for Connection, which is all about creating an internal podcast for your organization, created by your people for your people. So this is all about keeping people in the loop with conversations that you would overhear. So this is not really about just a top-down announcement, but it's really about what are the conversations that we're missing because we're apart from each other, and giving space for those. So again, if you are interested in that, then I'd love to hear from you. And I think that's it. I'm just going to roll out my usual calls for action. So I'll just tell you where you can find us. Sorry, I've been recording for quite a while today. So you can find us on LinkedIn. We're over at Virtual Not Distant. On Twitter, we are at Virtual Teamwork with a 0 instead of an O. If you sign up to our newsletter on virtualnotdistant.com, you can download our guide to leading through visible teamwork, which is all about asynchronous communication. And finally, I would love to hear from you. Tell us you're listening over by email, pilar@virtualnotdistant.com. Thank you very much for listening. A big thank you for listening to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast produced by Virtual Not Distant. If you have something to add to the conversation, let us know through the contact form over at virtualnotdistant.com. I have been your host, Pilar Orti, and I'm signing off now. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.